A survey of 5,700 farmers published last week by the American Farm Bureau Federation found that 70% of American farmers cannot afford the fertilizer they need for the current growing season. 70%. Not 70% of small hobby farms, not 70% of struggling operations in a single county. 70% of the farmers surveyed by the largest agricultural advocacy organization in the United States said they cannot afford the chemical inputs that their crops require to produce the yields that feed this country. And the reason is that 1/3 of the world's internationally traded fertilizer normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz, the same narrow waterway that Iran has blockaded since February 28 during its war with the United States and Israel. In mid-March 2026, U.S. fertilizer supply was at approximately 75% of normal levels, according to data cited by Fortune and The Conversation, and that shortage hit at the worst possible moment, right at the beginning of the window when Corn Belt farmers typically prepare their soil for the first fertilizer applications of the season. The window for optimal nitrogen application on corn runs from mid-April through early May for the first application, then late May through mid-June for the second. That window is not flexible. Corn absorbs the vast majority of its nitrogen needs during its early growth. Reducing nitrogen application by 10 to 15% or delaying it by 2 to 4 weeks can reduce corn yields by 10 to 25%. And the United States is the world's largest corn producer. A 10 to 25% decline in corn yields does not just affect the price of corn on the cob at your local grocery store. It collapses through the entire American food chain because corn is the foundation of the animal feed system that produces beef, pork, poultry, dairy, and eggs. And September is when the consequences of what is happening right now in American fields arrive at American tables. September is when the harvest comes in. September is when we find out whether the fertilizer that 70% of farmers could not afford produced a crop large enough to feed this country. And the Farm Bill, the legislation that governs every major agricultural policy and food assistance program in the United States, expires on September 30th, 2026. All of it at the same time. And the USDA used data from before the Iran war to project a 3.1% average increase for all food prices in 2026. That forecast was published in March. Fortune reported yesterday that the USDA has already revised the projection upward to 3.6%. And that revised forecast was made before the full impact of the fertilizer shortage, the drought, the diesel spike, and the tariff reimposition could be measured. The actual food price increase by September will almost certainly exceed 5% and could reach 8 to 10% for specific categories like beef, poultry, eggs, and corn-based products. In 2012, when a single Midwest drought slashed corn yields by 13%, U.S. poultry prices rose 20%. The 2026 agricultural crisis is not a single drought. It is 5 simultaneous supply-side shocks hitting the same growing season, and the American cattle herd has already been reduced to its smallest size in decades after persistent drought in previous years forced producers to kill 13.3% of the national beef cow herd. That culling reduced the breeding stock that produces the future supply of beef. The cows that were killed in 2022 and 2023 are not producing calves in 2026. That is a multi-year supply deficit that cannot be reversed by any policy change in any time frame shorter than 3 to 4 years, because cattle biology operates on cattle biology's timeline, not on Congress's timeline. Beef prices are already at record highs. By September, with reduced corn for feed, higher diesel for transport, fewer workers for processing, and a drought that is stressing the surviving herds, beef prices will be at levels that push a significant portion of American families out of the beef market entirely. The Strait of Hormuz did not just cut off oil, it cut off the chemical foundation of American agriculture. When Americans hear about the Strait of Hormuz, they think about oil. They think about gasoline prices. They think about $4.15 at the pump. What they do not think about, because nobody has told them, is that the Strait of Hormuz is also the world's single largest choke point for fertilizer. Roughly 1/3 of internationally traded nitrogen fertilizer, along with critical fertilizer components like sulfur, transits the strait every day under normal conditions. When Iran closed the strait on February 28th, it did not just cut off 20% of the world's oil. It cut off the chemical pipeline that modern agriculture depends on to produce the yields that feed 8 billion people. Raj Patel, a research professor at the University of Texas at Austin, called the strait a fertilizer choke point and warned that disruptions can amplify global food pressures faster than people think. And the price data confirms it. As of last month, ammonia prices in the Middle East were up 92% compared with a year earlier. Urea prices were up 70%. In the United States, ammonia prices are 41% higher than they were a year ago, and urea prices are 21% higher, according to RSM chief economist Joe Brussels. And the American Farm Bureau Federation economist Faith Perum told NBC News that farmers are going on year 4 of losses across the farm economy and that it is going to become harder and harder for them to put a crop in the ground. We're slowly starting to hear the longer this goes on, we're also going to have issues with even the availability of the fertilizer, Perum said. Not just the cost, the availability. The physical existence of the fertilizer and the quantities needed at the time needed. Because modern agriculture depends on precise timing, fertilizer is not something you can apply whenever you get around to it. It has to be applied during specific windows in the plant's growth cycle. Corn Belt farmers who missed the first application window in mid-April because fertilizer was unavailable or unaffordable have already compromised their yields for the entire growing season. That compromise is locked in. It cannot be undone. The corn that was supposed to receive nitrogen in mid-April and did not will produce less grain per acre in September. And that reduced grain per acre multiplied across millions of acres of American farmland is the food shortage that arrives in September, not as a sudden empty shelf, as a harvest that is 10 to 25% smaller than the country needed. And government loan guarantees and aid packages may help farmers cover higher costs, but as Fortune reported, they cannot address timing if enough fertilizer simply is not available when it is needed. The timing is biological. The plant does not negotiate with the supply chain. The plant either receives nitrogen during its critical growth window or it does not. If it does not, the yield is permanently reduced for that growing season, regardless of what happens to fertilizer prices later. The damage is done in the weeks that are passing right now, and by the time Americans see the result at the grocery store in September and October, the cause will be 5 months in the past, invisible, undiscussable, and irreversible. The grocery shopper in September will see a price and feel anger, but the price was set in April, in a field by a farmer who could not afford the fertilizer, in a country that closed a strait 8,000 miles away, in a war that the grocery shopper never voted for. That is the chain of causation, and almost nobody is explaining it. 61% of the continental United States is in drought, and the Southeast is at 97%. Fortune reported yesterday that 61% of the continental United States is currently under moderate to exceptional drought conditions according to NOAA, 61%, and the distribution is not uniform. 97% of the Southeast is in drought. 2/3 of the western United States is in drought. These are not minor dry spells. These are the conditions that, when they persisted in 2012, slashed Midwest corn yields by 13% and triggered a surge in feed prices that pushed U.S. poultry prices up 20%. And the 2012 drought was a single-factor event. The crop damage was caused by weather alone. In 2026, the drought is one of 5 simultaneous pressures on the agricultural system. The drought is reducing available water for irrigation and stressing crops. The fertilizer shortage from the Hormuz closure is reducing nutrient availability during critical growth windows. The diesel price spike from the Iran war is raising the cost of operating every tractor, combine, irrigation pump, and transport truck in American agriculture. The tariffs are raising the cost of imported farm equipment parts, chemicals, and seeds. And the labor shortage from immigration enforcement is reducing the number of workers available to plant, tend, and harvest the crops that survived the drought, the fertilizer shortage, the diesel shock, and the tariff costs. Michigan State agricultural economist Daniel Ortega told Fortune that longer, more severe droughts are becoming more frequent partly because of human-induced climate change. But the 2026 agricultural crisis is not a climate story alone. It is the story of a system under multi-directional stress where each pressure amplifies the others. Drought-stressed crops need more precise fertilizer application to produce adequate yields. But the fertilizer is unavailable or unaffordable. Drought conditions make irrigation essential, but diesel-powered irrigation pumps cost more to operate because diesel is up 30%. Harvesting whatever the drought-stressed, under-fertilized crop produces requires labor that the immigration crackdown has driven out of the fields. Each factor alone would depress yields. Together, they threaten to produce the smallest American grain harvest in years, at the exact moment when global demand for American agricultural exports is rising because crop yields in India and Brazil are also expected to be lower than normal in 2026, according to The Conversation. And Gregory Dacco, chief economist at EY Parthenon, told NBC News that anything grown that requires fertilizers, which is most of everything consumed, is potentially affected by this rise in fertilizer prices, and that as a result, prices could rise rapidly across grocery stores in the U.S. Take corn specifically. If corn prices spike, then feeding cattle becomes more expensive because corn is the primary feed grain for the American beef industry. Plus, cattle farmers are also dealing with higher fuel prices. The cost of beef has already hit record highs, and it could surge even more. But the corn problem does not end at beef. Corn is the feedstock for high-fructose corn syrup, which is in most processed foods in the American diet. Corn is the basis of ethanol, which is blended into the majority of American gasoline. Corn is fed to chickens that produce the eggs that are already at elevated prices from the avian influenza outbreak that has now resulted in the culling of over 185 million birds since 2022. Every direction the corn shortage radiates, it finds another product, another industry, another price increase waiting on the other end. And the corn that was planted this spring in under-fertilized, drought-stressed soil by farmers who are going bankrupt with equipment running on $4.15 diesel, harvested by a labor force that has been deliberately reduced, is the corn that is supposed to power all of those industries in September. Farm bankruptcies surged 46% in 2025, and farm debt is about to hit a record, $625 billion. In 2025, the number of Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies reached 315, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation. That was a 46% increase from the previous year. And before the Iran war began, the USDA estimated that farm sector debt could reach a record $624.7 billion in 2026. Record debt. In the same year that input costs are spiking, commodity prices are depressed, export markets are disrupted by tariffs, and the government shutdown froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season. Grist reported that the shutdown created, quote, because without adequate financial assistance from the federal government, the nation's food is on track to become more expensive and more limited in supply. 93% of respondents in the Farmer Mac Agricultural Lender Survey expect farm debt to increase further in 2026. Only 52% of U.S. farm borrowers are expected to be profitable this year, according to the latest ABA Farmer Mac survey. That means nearly half of American farms are expected to lose money in 2026. Half. And the farms that lose money eventually stop farming. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago reported estimated crop losses of $10 billion for soybeans, $20 billion for corn, and $8.5 billion for wheat in recent seasons. The National Corn Growers Association surveyed its members and found that 46% of U.S. farmers believe they are on the brink of a farm crisis. Not an inconvenience, not a tough year. A crisis. And when farms fail, the land is typically absorbed by larger corporate operations or taken out of production entirely. Either outcome reduces the resilience of the food system because fewer, larger operations are more efficient in normal times but more fragile during disruptions, and idled farmland does not come back into production quickly. The spring 2026 planting season is happening right now with 70% of farmers unable to afford adequate fertilizer, 61% of the country in drought, diesel at its highest price in years, labor shortages from immigration enforcement, export markets disrupted by tariffs, and farm debt at an all-time record. The harvest that results from this planting season arrives in September, and the harvest will reflect every one of these inputs, or rather the absence of every one of these inputs. And here is what most Americans do not understand about the relationship between farm economics and food prices. The farmer is the first link in a chain that ends at your dinner table. When the farmer cannot afford fertilizer, the crop is smaller. When the crop is smaller, the grain elevator receives less volume. When the grain elevator receives less, the feedlot pays more for corn. When the feedlot pays more, the meat packer pays more for cattle. When the meat packer pays more, the distributor pays more for beef. When the distributor pays more, the grocery store pays more per pound. Every step adds a margin. Every margin is applied to a higher base cost. When fertilizer, diesel, labor, insurance, interest, and equipment costs all increase simultaneously by 20 to 40%, the compound effect at the grocery register is catastrophic. And September is when that compound effect arrives, because September is when the harvest reveals the actual yield, the yield sets the commodity price, and the commodity price determines every downstream food price for the next 12 months. The Americans who think food prices are bad now are looking at prices based on last year's harvest. The harvest that was planted with adequate fertilizer, inadequate moisture, with adequate labor at pre-war diesel prices. This year's harvest was planted without any of those advantages, and the price of this year's harvest will be set in September. The Farm Bill expires September 30th, and there is no replacement and there is no plan for one. The Farm Bill is the single most important piece of agricultural and food assistance legislation in the United States. It governs crop insurance programs that protect farmers against harvest failures. It governs commodity support programs that stabilize farm income during price collapses. It governs conservation programs that pay farmers to protect soil and water. It governs research and extension programs that develop new agricultural technologies, and it governs the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which feeds more than 40 million Americans. The current Farm Bill, originally passed in 2018, was supposed to be reauthorized in 2023. It was not. It was extended once, then extended again. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act extended it for a third time through September 30th, 2026. Investigate Midwest reported that it is the third such extension due to the inability of the Senate and House Agricultural Committees to reach consensus, and predicted that when next fall rolls around, it will be more of the same, especially in the context of the midterm elections. The Farm Bill expires on September 30th, and there is no replacement bill in committee. No hearings have been scheduled. No markup sessions have been announced. The political bandwidth that a farm bill requires, months of committee negotiations, floor debates, conference committees, and presidential signatures, simply does not exist in a Congress that is simultaneously dealing with a war, a government shutdown aftermath, a debt ceiling crisis, a Medicaid overhaul, and a midterm election, which means the Farm Bill will almost certainly lapse on September 30th without a replacement. And when it lapses, crop insurance programs lose their authorization. Commodity support programs lose their funding mechanism. Conservation programs cannot accept new enrollments. And SNAP, which is already being cut by $295 billion over the next decade and subjected to expanded work requirements, loses the legislative framework that defines the program. Congress can pass another extension. Congress can fund programs through continuing resolutions. But the uncertainty itself is damaging because farmers cannot make planting and investment decisions for the 2027 season without knowing whether the support programs they depend on will exist in October. And if the Farm Bill lapses even temporarily, the USDA's ability to distribute emergency assistance to farmers who are losing money on their 2026 crops will be compromised at exactly the moment when that assistance is most desperately needed. The labor shortage on American farms is the crisis nobody wants to name because the cause is politically untouchable. The immigration crackdown that has been a central policy priority of the current administration has produced a labor shortage in American agriculture that farm organizations, food policy experts, and agricultural economists have been warning about since 2025, and that is now manifesting in the fields during the most critical planting season in recent memory. Roger Cooley, executive director of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, told Grist that the immigration enforcement agenda is the biggest issue impeding the future of the food system because it continues to throttle the farm and food sectors with labor shortages that risk supply shortfalls and sticker shock. Foreign workers, many of them undocumented, have historically filled the agricultural jobs that most Americans are unwilling to do, including 12-hour shifts in extremely hot fields picking vegetables, working in hazardous meatpacking plants, processing poultry, milking dairy cows at 4 a.m., and performing the back-breaking manual labor that puts food on American tables. When those workers are deported or deterred from entering the country, the jobs do not get filled by American workers. They go unfilled. The crops that require hand harvesting, which includes most fruits and vegetables, do not get harvested. They rot in the fields. And the meatpacking plants that require continuous labor to process the animals that feed the country operate at reduced capacity, which reduces meat supply and raises prices. The USDA data on farm labor has consistently shown that the agricultural workforce is aging and shrinking independent of immigration policy. But the enforcement actions of the past 18 months have accelerated that shrinkage to the point where major agricultural regions are reporting labor availability at historically low levels during the peak planting season. And the September harvest will require even more labor than the spring planting because the harvest is time-sensitive. Grain has to be harvested within a narrow window before weather or pest damage reduces quality. Fruits and vegetables must be picked at specific stages of ripeness, and dairy and livestock operations require continuous daily labor regardless of the season. If the labor is not available in September, whatever the drought-stressed, under-fertilized, diesel-expensive crop managed to produce will partially rot in the fields because there are not enough hands to bring it in. And rotting food in a country where 14% of households are food insecure and 34% of adults have skipped a meal in the past year is not an agricultural statistic. It is a moral catastrophe. And the labor shortage intersects with the avian influenza crisis in a way that creates a particularly dangerous feedback loop. The avian flu outbreak has now resulted in the culling of over 185 million birds since 2022. Egg prices remain at elevated levels nationwide. Poultry flocks are being rebuilt, but the rebuilding depends on the availability of labor at hatcheries, feed mills, and processing plants. When labor is scarce, the rebuilding slows. When the rebuilding slows, egg and poultry supply remains constrained for longer, and the meatpacking industry, which was already one of the most labor-intensive and labor-dependent industries in America, has been particularly hard hit by the enforcement actions. Meatpacking plants in Iowa, Nebraska, Georgia, and North Carolina have reported significant workforce reductions. Each reduction means fewer animals processed per day. Each reduction means longer wait times for ranchers who need to sell their cattle and hogs. Each reduction means higher per-unit processing costs that are passed to the consumer. And the consolidation of the meatpacking industry means that 4 companies control 85% of beef processing, 3 companies control 63% of pork, and 2 companies control 47% of chicken processing. When a labor shortage hits a consolidated industry, there is no alternative capacity to absorb the overflow. The bottleneck is real. It is physical, and it constrains the flow of food from the field to the table in a way that no price mechanism can resolve because the constraint is the number of human beings physically present to do the work. September is when the harvest needs to be processed, packaged, transported, and distributed through a system that does not have enough workers at any point in the chain. And the food that is not processed in time does not wait. It spoils. It becomes animal feed or compost or waste, and the American family that was going to eat it pays more for whatever is left. September is when SNAP cuts hit hardest and the food banks that caught the overflow are already overwhelmed. The SNAP program is being cut by $295 billion over the next decade, the largest reduction in the program's history. Work requirements are being expanded to ages 55 through 64. State administrative costs are increasing from 50% to 75% in fiscal year 2027, starting October 1st. And new restrictions on what SNAP benefits can purchase have already kicked in across multiple states, with SNAP beneficiaries suing the USDA, claiming that the new restrictions __quote_for__. The first restrictions took effect in Indiana, Iowa, Nebraska, Utah, and West Virginia on January 1st of this year, and an additional 17 states have received waivers that will go into effect later in 2026 or early 2027. And the food bank system that is supposed to catch the Americans who fall through the SNAP safety net is already operating beyond capacity. Grist reported that when SNAP shrinks, the whole food economy shrinks, and it does not just affect households who receive SNAP, it affects every household. Jared Grant, an agricultural economist at Ohio State University, confirmed that the shutdown exposed vulnerabilities throughout the nation's supply chain that could shift consumer behavior in grocery stores and slow overall consumer spending. Feeding America food banks reported record demand in 2025. The government shutdown that began October 1, 2025, disrupted SNAP benefits in at least 25 states. 42 million Americans who rely on SNAP spent weeks waiting on their benefits while the administration fought legal battles over the program's funding. And the farm-dependent counties that produce the food that feeds the cities are themselves experiencing increasing rates of food insecurity, according to USDA data. The farmers who grow the food cannot afford to eat. That sentence should stop every American in their tracks. The people who produce the calories that the rest of the country consumes are themselves going hungry because their costs exceed their revenues and their federal assistance was frozen during a shutdown, and their crops are under-fertilized and drought-stressed, and their debt is at a record high. September is when those farmers bring in whatever harvest they manage to produce. September is when the commodity prices are set that determine farm income for the year. September is when the SNAP funding structure shifts toward the state cost-sharing model that could cause states to cut eligibility or reduce benefits. September is when the Farm Bill expires. September is when the reduced harvest meets the reduced safety net, meets the reduced federal capacity, meets the reduced purchasing power of 40 million Americans who depend on food assistance to eat. And the UN World Food Program has predicted an additional 45 million people worldwide could face acute food insecurity by the end of 2026 if the Middle East conflict continues. America is not immune from those numbers. America is part of those numbers. And September is when the bill comes due for every decision, every policy, every enforcement action, every shutdown, every tariff, every war, and every fertilizer shipment that never arrived. And the 2018 Farm Bill that is about to expire on September 30th was already outdated before any of this happened. It was written for an agricultural economy that no longer exists. It was written before COVID, before the 2022 inflation spike, before the Ukraine war disrupted global grain markets, before the avian influenza outbreak that culled 185 million birds, before the Iran war closed the Strait of Hormuz, before the tariff regime that tripled customs duties, before the immigration enforcement that gutted the agricultural labor force, before the drought that is currently covering 61% of the continental United States. The Farm Bill that expires in September was designed for a world that ended years ago and has been extended 3 times because Congress cannot agree on what the replacement should look like. And each extension has been a patch on a system that needs to be rebuilt from the foundation. The September 30th expiration is not a procedural detail. It is the moment when the legal framework governing the food system of the most powerful country on earth temporarily ceases to exist. And it is happening at the exact moment when every input into that food system is under simultaneous stress from war, weather, policy, trade, enforcement, and economics. 40 million Americans depend on SNAP. 8 million of them are seniors. The expanded work requirements will push millions off the rolls over the next 2 years. The $295 billion in funding cuts will reduce benefits for those who remain. And the food banks that are supposed to catch the people who fall off SNAP reported record demand throughout 2025. Detroit food pantries reported lines stretching around the block during the government shutdown. In New York City, 40% of families cannot afford their weekly food costs. Nationwide, food insecurity has risen from 12.5% to 14% of households in a single year. And September is when the reduced harvest meets the expiring Farm Bill, meets the expanding work requirements, meets the shrinking benefits, meets the overwhelmed food banks, meets the 34% of American adults who have already skipped a meal in the past year. That is not a food policy debate, that is a food emergency. And it has a date, and the date is September.